Did you know that traditional medicine has been practiced in China for more than 5,000 years? I wonder, what do Americans think about traditional Chinese medicine?
Honestly, I never really thought about using it or trying it because I've only grown up using Western medicine.
Yeah, I think it's an alternative option, and it's been around for thousands of years, right?
Well, it's become more widely used by Westerners who are looking for different options to traditional Western pills and big pharma products.
Personally, I don't have any experience, but my mother has used the herbs for years, but I still don't know anything about it.
Well, then let's find out more.
Hi, I'm Jing-Ke Weng. I was born and raised in China and experienced traditional Chinese medicine as a child. But I was also trained in Western scientific methodology. So I understand all your issues and concerns. In fact, I've devoted my career to understanding the scientific basis for traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, and other traditions of plant-based or plant-derived medicines around the world. You know, plant-based medicine is not exclusive to TCM. They are independently derived from many different cultures around the globe. To truly understand plant-based medicine, we need to start with plants.
Do you know that the fossil records indicate the first plants appeared on land around 500 million years ago? And right after that, they quickly radiated across the globe and occupying almost every single habitable corner in the terrestrial environments. So today, we actually don't know exactly how many plant species are there on the planet, although there are more than 400,000 species have been already identified and classified by human beings to date. Plants are known as sessile organisms. That means when they're rooted, they can't easily move around. So they have to deal with a lot of different kinds of environmental assaults, ranging from high temperature swings, drought, to co-evolving bacteria, fungi, and animals, which consume plants as food. So to deal with these difficulties, they turn to chemistry. They evolved amazing abilities to make a huge array of structurally and functionally diverse small molecules to deal with these problems. Through evolutionary trials and errors, new chemicals continue to be evolved in plants and contributing to their different chemical properties. Actually, today, no two plant species are the same, and they all contain different chemical properties, and some of these properties making these plants useful as medicine. My first experience of plant-based medicine was as a child in China. In China, TCM is very commonly used to treat all kinds of illnesses, both at home and also in the hospital. So I remember when I was a kid, my mom would prepare me with different type of decoctions to treat different illnesses. For example, when you get common cold, she would cook this very hot soup made of ginger and also the white base of green onion. Sometimes in the summer, she could also walk into our backyard and pick out this very special plant known as fish mint. So I remember vividly this plant has this very distinct fishy taste. But these soups really make me feel much better. Also, when I was growing up in China, at the time there wasn't air conditioning in the summer. So it gets very hot in the summer, especially for kids playing outside for all day long. So heat stroke is very common. So under such situation, we would have this medicine made of patchouli oil, which is extremely effective in easing these symptoms. At times, people have still to go to the hospital. And at the hospital, both traditional Chinese medicine or Western medicine can be used. What I observe is for very emergent conditions, for example, fever or diarrhea, you get treated in the Western medical way. But when people have long-term conditions such as coughing or wound healing, and you get treated in the traditional Chinese medicine. As a child, I always had positive experiences with TCM. So I want to share with you one anecdote when I was a kid. So there was one time I suddenly had this tumor coming up on the side of my face. So my mom took me to the hospital. It was benign, but the Western doctor just said, okay, you have to surgically remove this tumor because it doesn't look good. But I was a kid that would have left a scar on my face, so my mom was very concerned. So she also took me to a traditional Chinese doctor to seek for the second opinion. At first, we saw a regular doctor, and she said this might be tumor, so she treated me with a bunch of herbs which are mean to treat tumor. So after a week or so, nothing happens. So then we got to see an expert. So it's very hard to schedule with her, but she saw me and she said, is there anything happened around the time? So I told her I had this eye infection about 2 weeks before this tumor emerged. So she said it must be related to inflammation with your eye. So I would give you things that would ease your inflammation. So she gave me a prescription and I took this for 2 weeks and magically this tumor went away. So since then I was really a strong believer for traditional Chinese medicine. So Chinese traditional medicine is so deeply rooted into my native Chinese culture, so I accepted it wholeheartedly as a kid without much thought. And because many of this actually came from the care you receive from your loving parents. It was only until later I became a highly trained scientist, I started to ponder about the scientific basis for traditional Chinese medicine. So as a child, it seemed to me all this was like magic. But as scientists, I now understand TCM is based on distilled knowledge of 5,000 years of experiments. So modern humans arose in Africa around 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. And as early hunter-gatherers, they had to interact with plants, most of the time just searching for foods. But through this process, inevitably, they would encounter some plants which offer medicinal properties that can ease illnesses. Just like the rise of chemodiversity in plants, which is entirely a trial and error process, our experience as humans encountering with plants is also a trial and error process. And this process is based on thousands of years of experimentations on human subjects. So at first, information about plant-based medicine must have been passed from generation to generation through oral traditions. As language emerged in different cultures, passage of such information became so much more effective and faithful. In China, a few key figures emerged who began to record and systematize the anecdotal experiences that were passed through generations and thousands of years. So these giants really laid the foundation and science of traditional Chinese medicine. They summarized what happened before them and put them into written works. And they published many classical treatises, which became so important in traditional Chinese medicine today. Perhaps more importantly, they detailed their methods and materials in those treatments. And these then can be reproduced by people who follow them. And these became the foundations of traditional Chinese medicine, which has been going for thousands of years until today. It is worth noting that the description of methods and materials used in these studies and also the reproducibility are very similar to the scientific principles we now adopt in modern scientific methodology. Now let's talk about who some of these giants are. In the history of traditional Chinese medicine, there are so many giants. I think it's unfair to not mention all of them, but because we only have limited time, so we're going to talk about a few of them. So the first giant I would like to mention, his name is Shen Nong. So in direct translation Chinese, that means divine farmer. So he emerged around 200 AD. So that was about the time when there wasn't any written language. So his stories and his work were summarized many years later. So he was the first person in Chinese history who taught people how to grow crops and how to use plants as sources for medicine. So in his book, he described 365 entries. Most of these are plants. Many of these are still being used in Chinese medicine. For example, ephedra. It is a very effective anti-fever herb. Licorice, which is a very common ingredient in almost all prescriptions that you see today in Chinese remedies. And also many other medicines that have been described in this book. So many of the ingredients and plants described by Shen Nong became the foundation, which was further developed over thousands of years since that time. Actually, this book I'm holding is a reprint of what was published around 200 AD. So it has a lot of illustrations of the plants that were described as you've seen here. So behind every single plant, there's typically a story talking about how this plant can be used to treat a particular illness. And it's just so much fun to go through this book, which carries so much value and has such a long history. The second giant I would like to talk about, his name is Zhang Zhongjing. So he lived around the area which is known as the Eastern Han Dynasty. So it's in the 3rd century, and it was a terrible time in Chinese history when there were a lot of warlords fighting wars all the time. So at the time there were a lot of illnesses because there are a lot of people. Many people die from the war and a lot of illnesses going around. Many illnesses are related to bacterial infection, as known as today. So people had terrible cold, fever, diarrhea, and these symptoms. So Zhang Zhongjing was the first to start systematize all the treatments before him. So he started to try many different therapies known to his time and start to develop theories behind this. And he was actually the first to describe in detail the disease symptoms and also human body's reaction to different therapies. And that's why he was respected as the very first great physicians in Chinese history. So he wrote this book known as the Treatises for Cold Damage. And it's really coming up with classical recipes for treating everything related to cold and fever. So I remember very vividly, he would say in his therapies, if you have certain symptom, you would treat with this particular plant. And if the reaction is A, then you follow up with this one treatment. If the reaction is B, then you alter your therapy to something different. So it's extremely empirical and systematic. And even after many centuries, people still adopt the way he cured these diseases. And he's really one of the foundational people in traditional Chinese medicine. This is Material Medica. So it's the most comprehensive compendium of medicinal plants in Chinese history. And it was compiled together by this guy whose name is Li Shizhen. So he spent his entire life, over 33 years, going through all places in China and collecting knowledge from local people, and eventually came up with this work. And it's really the classic of classics, and described almost everything which had been used in traditional medicine, including thousands of plants, thousands of animals, and also minerals. It is really a remarkable piece of work. And through this process, he has also tried many of these materials on himself. For times, he almost killed himself by doing this. But just through this type of spirit, we now have this work which becomes the foundation of traditional Chinese medicine today. So now I also would like to talk about Ge Hong. So he is a polymath in history of China. He served as a minor official in a southern city of China. And his day job is just to rule his little town. And he's also very well known for his accomplishment in Taoism, literature, poetry, alchemy, and eventually medicine. So he authored a few very important texts in Chinese medicine. But China isn't the only place where plant-based medicine are used.
So now we're in the lab looking at these plants. Actually, plant-based medicine has been developed independently in multiple cultures around the globe. So we have a few plants. So here with me is Sophia Xu. She is a graduate student at MIT Biology Department, and she's spending a lot of time studying these very interesting medicinal plants from Europe. Sophia.
So this is a plant in the genus Galiga, and it is related to goat's root, which was used in European cultures to treat symptoms of diabetes. And here in this lab, we're interested in studying how do these plants make the active compound, which is found to be gallatin, and trying to use that knowledge in order to develop a new, potentially a new diabetes treatment.
Yeah. So Sophia, looking at this plant, this looks a little different. Can you tell us a little bit about this plant?
So this plant is in the genus Verbicina, completely unrelated to goat's root. This is actually a daisy. And it has independently evolved the ability to make gallatin. So we're also very interested in studying protein evolution in plants and trying to understand how this plant is also able to make gallatin.
So here is another example of medicinal plant. So here with me is Dr. Michael Torrance Spence. He is a postdoctoral fellow in my lab studying this particular plant from Tibet. Michael.
So these peculiar plants are within the rhodiola genus. So it has about 90 members. These grow at very high altitudes and very slowly. People have been studying these plants and using them to traditional medicine for 1,000 years or so because they contain many interesting natural products or just natural chemicals that have useful purposes in treating depression and altitude sickness and a number of other ailments. Recently, people have also found that many chemicals from these plants also have potential applications as anti-cancer and other anti-cardiovascular disease properties. Jing-Ke and I, in this lab, we are studying how these plants make these molecules in an effort to export that chemistry and put it in other organisms that we can grow in test tubes to make these chemicals for us. And not only does this produce these high valuable compounds, but this also takes off ecological pressure of these plants themselves because these are over harvested in their natural environment, which is growing in very high altitude in Central Asia, where they're over harvested. So many species within this genus actually are threatened ecologically. And so we hope to be able to take this pressure off and actually provide these chemicals as an alternative way from direct harvesting from the natural sources.
It is extremely important time and interesting time to demystify and rediscover traditional Chinese medicine. There has been so much medical knowledge that has been accumulated over the process of thousands of years. Now we have all the modern tools to rediscover this. So through the last 30 years of research, we've understood so much about normal physiology and disease biology in humans. In the same time, we also made a lot of advance in plant biology. We learned how plants evolved the ability to make so many diverse molecules and what these molecules are and why these molecules are so important for plants to survive in very difficult conditions. Now we can combine human biology with plant biology and discover new treatments for human diseases. In another area, we have the advance in so-called synthetic biology. We learned so much about how plants manufacture these medicinal natural products. And it used to be that we have to purify these compounds from plants. Now we can use synthetic biology to engineer sustainable hosts, for example, crop plants or microbes to make exactly the same medicinal natural products. Also, better than that, we can start improvise and add additional functional groups to make new chemical entities that can potentially treat multiple human diseases. Here I want to give you an analogy of what I think where we are in terms of Eastern medicine or traditional medicine versus the Western medicine. So there's only one fact. So there's only one truth about disease or normal physiology. And traditional medicine has come a long way trying to dig a tunnel this way into the mountain. And now in the past 100 years, using modern scientific methods, we're digging the tunnel this way. So there's still a big gap in between these two different approaches. Hopefully sometime we can meet in the middle and to be able to explain the true scientific underpinnings about traditional medicine. And we're actively working on it.
Hi, I'm Steve Seiler, and I'm here today with Dr. Jing-Ke Weng, who's an expert on the science behind traditional Chinese medicine and other forms of plant-based medicine. Dr. Weng is a member of the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research, one of America's leading research institutions. He's also an assistant professor of biology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Before joining the Whitehead and MIT, Dr. Weng was a postdoctoral fellow at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. He received his Ph.D. from Purdue University and his B.S. cum laude in biotechnology from Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, China. Jing-Ke, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in plants.
I was born and raised in China in the early 80s. That was really a very interesting point of time in Chinese history. The Cultural Revolution just ended. And I was also the first generation of single child policy. So I grew up by myself without siblings, and I had a lot of attention from my parents. So it happens that my home was close to Hangzhou Botanical Garden, where my dad would take me for morning exercise. And I played around freely in the botanical garden, got to know all sorts of plants. I also learned a great deal from my parents, and that's how I got into plant biology early on.
And how was it that you came to America?
My dad is a professor in geology. He had a chance to visit the States in the early 90s. So he actually spent 1 year in Texas A&M University being a visiting professor. So at that time, he discovered you can actually come to the States and study and get paid. So I was in the 5th grade, and he sent me a lot of brochures about a grad school application. So that kind of planted the seeds in my heart. So later on, I decided after undergraduate study, I should apply for grad school. And I applied, I got into Purdue University. That's how I came to the US.
And why is the study of traditional Chinese medicine important today?
It is very important. Early on, basically before modern science, traditional herbal medicine is the medicine for mankind. So as we know today, there are many forms of traditional herbal medicines that independently evolved in multiple cultures around the world. Now, starting from the early 20th century, because of the advance of synthetic chemistry, we had the capability to make drugs using chemistry. So then that started to drive this huge boom of pharmaceutical industry. But now we're kind of, that innovation is drying out because we realize that the chemical diversities we can make through synthetic chemistry is still quite limited. So I think it is a very important time to go back to plants and discover new chemistry and biochemistry that can eventually give up new opportunities for medicine.
So where we are today, has the chemical synthesis completely overtaken traditional remedies and plant-based remedies?
I think this is the current trend. I think if you look at the major pharmaceutical companies, Most of them are doing small molecule, which are derived from chemical synthesis, but they are drying out. I think many of the patents early on are expiring, and these large pharmaceutical companies are getting into a lot of challenges to come up with new chemical entities that can treat.
But aren't some of the traditional, or excuse me, plant-based medicines still used today? Things like opium or quinine was used for a long time. The yew tree is a source of an anti-cancer medicine. So
oh, that's exactly right. I think starting from the earlier 19th century, people discovered that you can go to a plant which has been used traditionally in medicine and isolate single molecules that work like a Western type of medicine. So just as you mentioned, you named a few of these molecules played very important roles in treating various of human diseases.
So how would you estimate what percentage of the current pharmaceutical armamentarium is based on plant-derived products?
Very surprisingly, actually, more than 25% of the drugs we use today are either directly derived from plants or being modified from molecules that are identified from plants. So I can just give you an example. Morphine was actually the first drug isolated from plants that made into a very important painkiller for us. And these days, the molecules that we use in the clinics actually are further modified from morphine, so they have much less tendency to get addictions. But the initial inspiration was coming from plants.
I've heard that recently there's been a medicine that came from a plant that treats malaria, and it was very important, maybe even a Nobel Prize?
Right, so that's the story of artemisinin. So it's a super important medicine for treating malaria, and the way it's been discovered was very interesting. So in the 1970s, so the Chinese government was putting money into supporting finding drugs to treat malaria, which was a huge issue for during the Vietnam War. So this woman, a very famous phytochemist, her name is Yu. She was assigned this job. So she actually went through a great deal of ancient Chinese medicine text. And eventually she kind of came to this book, which was authored by Ge Hong. So he lived during the 4th century in China. And he actually described a plant known as Artemisia annua, which was used to treat symptoms related to malaria. And the specific way of preparing this plant is also quite interesting, because most of the Chinese medicine, as you know, was prepared by boiling the plant material. But for this particular case, you have to use cold water to extract the plant and drink the cold water. So Yu eventually found that this molecule is actually heat sensitive. So she, based on this particular ancient text, came up with a new way of extracting the plant material, eventually isolating artemisinin, which is the single molecule that has magic effect in killing the parasites.
That's really interesting. So quinine, which was a natural-based product, was used for malaria until it was replaced by another natural-based product. Yeah. That's great. Now, what do you say to people who say that there's no scientific basis for traditional Chinese medicine?
It is being debated. So the whole traditional medical systems came about before modern science. So it's very easy to entirely deny this. But I would argue that it is the medical systems that have treated human beings for thousands of years. When it works, it works. Although many of the mechanisms we still don't know why it works, but I truly believe there are a lot of scientific merit that can be discovered from these medical systems.
And what does the role of sort of trial and error have in this? You know, our ancestors obviously didn't start out as medical doctors. They had tried different things, and how did that influence the development?
Right, so I have spent much time reading through these ancient texts. One thing I kind of realized, just as I said, is a trial and error process which happened on human subjects. And it was done in a very thorough methods, which is exactly what we do in current scientific exploration. So there are a few giants in the fields. They summarized what people have done before, and they systemize the whole thing in writing. So, and it's a very thorough process. They wrote down exactly the details about the materials they used. They tried these on real patients, and they wrote out specific reactions that these patients would have. And they wrote down all the process so that people who follow them can replicate these trials. So these are remarkable collection of data which is very hard to collect these days, and we should definitely ignore these. And these actually follow nowadays considered as scientific methods.
So based on what they knew at the time, this was an early development of what we now recognize as scientific methodology, which we use every day. That's very interesting. Well, you mentioned earlier that traditional medicines, traditional Chinese medicine, is a source of a lot of potential new molecules for research into treatments for diseases. If it's such a gold mine of information, why hasn't it been tapped before?
Actually, we have tried this, especially during the late 60s and 70s. A few pharmaceutical companies, including and also government agencies, have gone to different parts of the world collecting plant materials, isolating single molecules from these plants. At the time, actually, many interesting leads were found, but there were a few technical hurdles that were so hard to get over. That's why many of these leads were not followed up. In the same time, there was a burst in the development of high throughput organic chemical synthesis. So that became the trend of pharmaceutical development. So that wasn't really, that's why the plants weren't the major sources of pharmaceuticals since the 70s.
So essentially the opportunity was there, but we didn't yet have the tools to exploit that opportunity.
Yeah, so that was 10, 20 years ago, but just in recent years, there were a few major breakthroughs in multiple disciplines in biology that now makes drug discovery from plants much more efficient. So I can speak for these advances. So the first one is genome sequencing. So when the first human genome was sequenced, it actually, as a community, we spent over $1 billion, or maybe $10 billion in doing so. Now you can sequence any organism with the cost of $1,000. So that really facilitates us to be able to discover genomic information of many of the medicinal plants. So that's number one. So the second one is the source limitation. Many of these interesting molecules are made in the plants, but they're not made in larger quantity. And in some cases, they're made by endangered species where you can't just get a large quantity of these materials. So even if you find something interesting, you just cannot produce larger quantities to make into drug. But now we can use this new way known as synthetic biology. We learn how plants make them. We clone the genes that are responsible for making these interesting molecules, then engineer a sustainable vehicle, for example, yeast, baker's yeast, or E. coli, a bacteria. So you can use these vehicles to make exactly the same plant molecules that eventually can make into drugs.
So you turn these yeast, if you could say, into manufacturing plants for potentially interesting molecules.
Right, exactly. So the advance of genomics, so the ability for us to read genetic information from these medicinal plants, in combination with our ability to engineer microbes to make the same molecule, really make it possible to rediscover interesting drug candidates from plant sources.
And how did you personally become interested in plant-based science?
So as I said, I was kind of really pulled into plants as a kid. But after I started grad school, I realized that plants are beautiful beyond their look. So plants are so calming, we grow them in the backyard. But if you look deeper, they contain this complexity which is at the chemical level. So they're not visible to our eyes, but there's this beauty in chemistry that is really remarkable. And also later on, I realized that to support this chemical diversity, plants must contain very complicated metabolic systems containing all kinds of catalysts that eventually gave rise to this complexity. So that beauty in chemistry and biochemistry that kind of pulled them into this field.
And how did you end up at the Whitehead Institute?
So after I finished my doctoral studies at Purdue, I went to do a postdoc training with Joe Noel at the Salk Institute. So I was combining what I learned from doctoral studies in plant biochemistry and genetics with structural biology. So after I finished postdoctoral training, actually I established a realm of study that's quite unique. And at that particular time, there was this surge of next-gen sequencing, the development of synthetic biology and genomics really made it possible to explore a lot of non-model species, including all kinds of medicinal plants. So I applied nationally. I interviewed at many universities, and I realized that Whitehead Institute is the best place to start a career. And they offered me a job. I signed on, and since then it was really great.
The rest is just history.
Exactly.
So what I infer from what you're saying is that the field itself had been limited to a number of model plants before and what they were looking at. And suddenly you were kind of there at the right time when the right technology was developed to do things that couldn't have been done before.
That's exactly right. So for myself, I also started from model plants. So we have to realize that studying plant biology using these models is extremely important. But I'm very biased, but I really see that the importance of plants are the diversity where the chemicals lie in. So I think it is my mission, and also I feel responsibility to go beyond model species and relook all these non-model species and explore their chemistry.
And you said, I think earlier to me before the show started, that you're interested in how plants make stuff.
Exactly.
Can you expand a little bit on that?
Right. So if you ask a kid, what is this piece of rock? So actually, when I was a kid, since my dad is a geologist, I was also always presented with questions like this: what is stuff? So if we look at this table, you kind of wonder, oh, the table is made of wood, and what is this thing? At a molecular level. So it is a very foundational question that just interests me. And the more you dig into that really reveals the beauty and complexity of the plant biochemistry system, where the plants have evolved so many different catalysts to be able to make a wood or a small molecule.
So if it's possible to do so in layman's terms, can you explain to us exactly how you conduct your research and what are the methods and materials and instruments that you would use to do what you're doing in the labs at the Whitehead?
Okay. So I can raise an example where everybody is familiar with. That's the chili pepper, right? So when you pick a chili pepper, you realize that you eat it, it's extremely spicy. So it is an observation that you can sense, but it boils down to molecular interactions. So it happens that chili pepper has evolved the ability to make this compound called capsaicin. So it's a small molecule that has this unique shape that binds to your pain receptor on the tongue. So when you eat it, you felt pain. So for plants, they get protected because that's a very powerful way of deterring herbivores. It's also quite interesting where you have birds who feed on peppers but do not sense pain because they have acquired mutations in this particular pain receptor molecules so that they do not feel pain, but they can eat the pepper and pass the seeds. So that's the starting point for our research at Whitehead. So we study many aspects of this observation. We want to identify the chemical structure of capsaicin. We want to know the genetic basis of capsaicin biosynthesis, how chili pepper makes capsaicin through steps of reactions, and why capsaicin is spicy. What are the human counterpart? What are molecules in our body that are responsible for perceiving this sensation? So this involves many of the genetic tools, instruments required for chemical analysis. When we study metabolism, we also do a lot of synthetic biology, reconstituting the same pathway in a different system, and also ultimately understand the structural basis of these enzymes through tools like X-ray crystallography, really to know why the enzymes evolve this particular way so that they can handle these very unique chemical reactions.
Well, that's a great example, but in the example you used, capsaicin, this is a plant that produces one molecule or item of interest. I understand there are situations where plants produce multiple molecules, all of which act together to produce a singular effect. How do you deal with that kind of complexity?
It's a very good question. So this is, I would say, this is plants' way of coming up with the best molecule that works for them. So when we develop a drug, we have very clear target, and we design a few molecules that can potentially work. But plants evolved all this chemical diversity through a trial and error process, which takes hundreds of million years to occur. So you may have, starting at the starting point, a few molecules, but over time, the plants do produce hundreds of thousands of molecules. And as long as they do not have detrimental effects on the plant growth, they'll be there. And to a certain point, if some of these molecules work, for example, deter certain bacteria or pathogen, they'll be selected. That's why when we sample a plant, you typically find so many molecules, but this is how nature has come up with the chemodiversity, and maybe one of these molecules become a big hit for themselves or as a drug for humans.
So this is nature's greatest hits that you're discovering.
Exactly.
But now you just mentioned that these plants have thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of molecules being made. You know, if there's 6 or 10 or 20 that are all active in producing effect, how do you tease that out? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, it is very hard, and it's a working process. I think as a field, we've been relatively successful in dealing with single molecules. So we talked about the case of artemisinin from Artemisia annua or capsaicin from chili pepper. But in practice, we do find there are combinatorial effects that come in from multiple compounds in the same plant, or in traditional treatment, you often have different ingredients all mixed together. So different compounds from different plants coming together arrive at very specific therapeutic effects. So this is still pretty hard to dissect mechanistically, but I can propose, for example, one simple mechanism. For example, licorice, as you know, is a fundamental ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine. It's added to many different descriptions. So what I propose is that there might be some compounds in licorice actually inhibit drug metabolism enzymes in the liver, so that if you have a more active ingredient in the same description, combining things together, you will achieve much better therapeutic effects.
Well, talking of combinations, you know, as I look back at the last, say, couple decades in Western development of pharmaceuticals, it's sort of been, you know, one target, one molecule, one drug. And now they're bumping up against a wall, these complicated multifactorial diseases like diabetes, for instance. What kind of a role does traditional Chinese medicine or plant-based medicines have in looking at these types of diseases where the old Western model, one target, one drug, one medicine, just doesn't work anymore?
Yeah, so I think these days we're really troubled by those so-called complex diseases. So you mentioned diabetes. I can list a few more. For example, neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, for example. So the cause for these diseases are not a single protein target, which is very well handled by Western pharmaceutical process. You have a biochemical target, then you find molecules, small molecules that can inhibit the activity of this target. But when the disease is coming from a systematic origin, it's very hard to do things to stop that. So I would argue that traditional medicine, for example, herbal medicine, has a lot of knowledge which we can learn from. First is systematic. it monitors the phenotypes from the system. So if you go to see a Chinese herbal doctor, they'll monitor your phenotypic outcome upon certain treatment. So it's systematic. Second, it's very personalized. So according to your phenotype or according to your reactions to certain treatments, the doctor would adjust the way that they give different type of treatment. So these are the things that are kind of distilled over thousands of years in traditional medicine. And we just have to rediscover them and especially reveal the molecular underpinnings of this efficacy.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you're most proud of, things that you're working on, things that you've done?
Yeah, so since I joined the Whitehead Institute, I had fun to explore many medicinal plants. Many of these plants actually played very important roles in certain cultures. So there's one plant called the kava. It is a native plant to Polynesian islands. So to native people on these islands, this plant is very important because people would drink this plant as a tea during their ceremonies, where conflicts are resolved, culture being passed. What I realized, this plant has a very calming effect. I also personally drank this tea, and it really works. And I realized there is this class of molecules known as kava-lactones, which are produced in very high amounts in this plant. So I got interested, and we invested a lot of efforts trying to understand how this class of molecules are made in this plant. We've made a lot of progress finding new catalysts involved in this process. And we're also working in this interface between plant molecules and animals. We have introduced zebrafish and a mouse as animal models to really study the molecular interactions between kava-lactones from kava plants with animals. So we really hope through research like this, we would be able to develop new drugs, for example, for treating anxiety and insomnia. So that's just one example coming from my lab.
Sounds like you're doing a lot of different things. What is it that you like best about your job?
It's wonderful to be a professor and a scientist. I think there are three major aspects I really like my job. First is the freedom to explore scientific world. So growing up as a kid, I was always very curious about nature. Nature is an endless place to offer inspiration. So as an adult, I think I can continue the dreams I had as a kid. This is wonderful. So the second thing is you can, through your work, you can potentially make meaningful, positive, and also transformative impact on society. So that's one of the major motivations that push me forward on a daily basis. The third is you get opportunity to interact with young people all the time. I truly enjoy mentoring students, and as I age, the people who I work with always remain the same age. I really enjoy that feeling.
So let's come back to traditional Chinese medicine for a moment. Why do you think it's still such a mystery to people?
It is something, I think, rooted in people's native culture. So I grew up in China, so accepting traditional Chinese medicine is not a problem for me. So it was my major treatment when I was a kid. It was given to me by my loving parents. So I accepted it wholeheartedly without thinking too much. Only until when I became highly trained as a scientist, later on, I started thinking about the molecular mechanisms. But if we're taking this from one culture to the other, it definitely creates an acceptance issue because people were not familiar with that, and there are debate about what percentage of traditional medicine is actually pseudoscience. So there's a lot of doubt and uncertainty in this field. That's why people would have a hard time accepting this.
And how would you respond to people who would say, well, these medicines aren't approved by the FDA?
Yeah, it is a very good question. So when these traditional medical systems were developed, there wasn't FDA, right? So it came about through trials and errors over thousands of years. And I believe most of it have to work to be sustained until today. Definitely, if we want to promote traditional medicine from one culture to the rest of the world, we have to apply very high standard. And now we also have developed modern scientific standards. We should apply the whole process in kind of legitimizing traditional medicine. For example, doing FDA-guided clinical trials is a very good way to build confidence for people to believe in certain type of treatment. And also standardizing the way that herbal remedies are produced is another very important procedure I think has to be implemented in the future.
So we just talked about people who would say these medicines are not approved by the FDA, they're bad. The flip side, there are also people who will say these are natural medicines, therefore they're better than the kind of thing you would get at the pharmacy.
Right, so that's the other end of the spectrum, which we should also be very aware of. So plants make tons of molecules, as we said, and they're natural, but natural doesn't equal to zero risk. Many of these molecules are made by plants to protect themselves. So if we overdose on these molecules, it can also create safety issues.
So let's talk a little bit about environmental changes. Obviously, these are plant-based remedies, that's what we're talking about. And in China, there's a wide variety of biodiversity, but that biodiversity is becoming smaller and smaller. How is climate change and the man-made impact on biodiversity affecting the research that you do and ultimately the kinds of things that you might focus on first as opposed to what you might focus on later in your career?
Yeah, so it's a huge issue. So there are many folds of problems in this. First, we now live in a world economy. So there are emerging demand from parts of the world craving for a certain type of herbal remedy. And then this actually caused ecological disasters on other side of the world where these plant materials are produced. Many of these endangered species can be only found in the wild. So there are a lot of illegal harvesting going on that hurt our environment. Second, global warming, as you said, the environment of the planet is changing rapidly. There's increase of temperature, which pose risks to certain endangered plant species, and some of the species you can no longer find from the wild. And also we know that plants are very responsive to the environment. Many of the medicinal products, natural products, are produced only under certain environments. So when people start to take a wild plant species, trying to farm this and sell as a medicine, they lose their medicinal properties.
Because goldenroot is part of that, isn't it?
Exactly. So you mentioned goldenroot, which is a native plant to Tibet. So they grow in very high altitude, and they're actually being illegally harvested. And when people trying to grow this in a lab or in a greenhouse, they just do not make these compounds. Apparently, it needs this very harsh environment to trigger the synthesis of these valuable molecules.
That's interesting. And I guess the other question is, leaving aside the changes and the reduction of biodiversity, if some of these projects that you're working on bear fruit in terms of medicine, the demand is going to be huge. How are you going to supply all of these medicines to people who now are, the supply and demand is very limited?
Right, so this has been an issue for plant-derived medicine. So we talked a few molecules, for example, artemisinin, or there are a few anti-cancer drugs that were approved by FDA that are derived from plants. So for the current practice, these molecules are still being isolated with a very lengthy process from plant materials. And that's really a bottleneck. So we discussed this topic about synthetic biology. I think this will really change the situation, because after you learn how plants make these molecules using their own biochemical tools, the enzymes, you can use synthetic biology to recombine these enzymes in a sustainable system. So it could be a crop plant, for example, maize or soybean, or it could be also a microbe like yeast. As you're brewing beer, you can brew the yeast strain that produce these high value molecules.
If I heard you correctly, paclitaxel, which comes from the yew tree, has been around, I think, since the 70s, they're still just growing a bunch of yew trees and crushing them up and eventually synthesizing it. That's as far as we've come in manufacturing.
Right. Unfortunately, that is the case. In terms of artemisinin, it's produced from plants, but there are researchers have reported successful engineering effort so that you can produce the same molecule in an engineered string of yeast. So this is really exciting.
Well, Jing-Ke, thank you for joining us. You're obviously a young man, but there's so much left for you to think about, and it's enormous. Perhaps someday people will be referring to you as one of the giants of Chinese medicine.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed our discussion today.
Thanks.